tucked away in the city of Kyoto, a small company intent on creating traditional Japanese playing cards arose, Nintendo. Nintendo, meaning leave luck to heaven, eventually decided to get into the video game market, but at the worst possible time. The Atari 2600 and the lack of quality control had completely crashed the gaming market in America. Facing insurmountable odds and retailers who had no interest in ever carrying a video game product again, Nintendo had an uphill battle to face when they would introduce the Famicom, or Nintendo Entertainment System, to America. Founded by Fusajiro Yamauchi in 1889, Nintendo sold handcrafted karuta, or Japanese playing cards. He was a skilled craftsman who handmade his hanafuda, or flower cards, by pounding the bark of trees into a paste and adding clay. These cards became the most popular cards in the Kyoto region and were sold in the Kanto region as well. Business boomed when the Yakuza decided to start gambling with the hanafuda, and in 1907, Yamauchi expanded his business into becoming the first Japanese manufacturer of Western trading cards as well. By 1929, Nintendo had become the largest Japanese playing card company, and Yamauchi was ready to retire. His son-in-law, Sekiryo Kaneda, became the second president of Nintendo, bringing with him a passion for real estate. He worked to expand the profitability of the business by adding assembly line workers and ruling with a notoriously iron fist. Sekiryo Kaneda, now named Sekiryo Yamauchi, had his son-in-law who was positioned to take over Nintendo. However, in 1932 he ran away from his family, leaving both his wife and his child, who had been born in 1927, Hiroshi Yamauchi. With no father to help care for him, Hiroshi was raised by his grandparents, who raised him as strictly as they ran Nintendo. And at the young age of just 21, Sekiryo Yamauchi had a stroke and pulled Hiroshi out of school, naming him the head of Nintendo in 1949. Hiroshi Yamauchi brought a number of reforms with him to the dismay of Nintendo's employees, who were already resentful of his young age. He fired every manager from when Sekiryo Yamauchi was head of the company, so there would be no one left to question his authority. From there, he changed the name of the company to Nintendo Karuta, and the changes ensued. In 1959, he made Nintendo's first licensing deal with Disney in order to make playing cards with Disney's characters on them. He then worked to get Nintendo cards into larger department and toy stores to immediate success. In spite of this success, Yamauchi wanted the company to expand even more and felt limited by the trading card niche Nintendo had carved out. He changed the company name, once again, to NCL, or Nintendo Company Limited, and took Nintendo public in order to finance a series of new ventures. The first was packaged instant rice, and a failure. His next was in opening a love hotel, to which he was rumored to be his own best customer, despite being married. Finally, he attempted a taxi company to some success, before finally ending both this and the love hotel, deciding to focus on Nintendo's roots: entertainment. It was then, in 1969, he had Hiroshi Imanishi oversee a brand new research and development division of Nintendo called Games. Imanishi and Yamauchi then called Gunpei Yokoi into their office. Gunpei Yokoi had worked for Nintendo to maintain the assembly line machines that created their Hanafuda cards, and suddenly was tasked to create, quote, something great by Christmas 1969. Yokoi showed them a project he'd been working on in his spare time, the Ultra Hand, and was given the go-ahead to produce them. It sold 1.2 million units and was a major success for Nintendo. From then on, Gunpei Yokoi would show Yamauchi concepts and ideas, which Yamauchi would instinctively turn down or give the go-ahead with notes. The R&D team grew, and thanks to their success, Masayuki Uemura approached Nintendo wanting to join, and together, he and Gunpei Yokoi created a light gun, the Bullet, to such great success, Nintendo needed to expand in the early 1970s. Genyo Takeda, who had joined the R&D team after college, then worked with Uemura to create a laser shooting range players could come to. While the concept was popular, Japan was hit by an economic crisis. Orders for the range were canceled, and Nintendo was suddenly on the brink of collapse. Looking for the next big thing, Yamauchi grew interested in the new industry of video games growing in America. He attempted to negotiate a license to manufacture the MAGNAVOX Odyssey in Japan, however, was unsuccessful. From there, Nintendo partnered with Mitsubishi in order to create the Color Game TV6 and Color Game TV15. Both were mildly successful and allowed Nintendo to stay afloat. Meanwhile, in 1977, Yamauchi received a request from an old friend to meet with his son. His son had just graduated from college with a degree in industrial design and was an artist. Yamauchi told his friend, "We need engineers, not painters," but as a favor to his friend, met with the son anyways. This son's name was Shigeru Miyamoto. Despite not needing an artist, Yamauchi was impressed by Miyamoto's ingenuity and created a position for him as the company's first staffed artist. However, his big break wouldn't come until 1980. It was in 1980 when Hiroshi Yamauchi's son-in-law, Minoru Arakawa, finally buckled and accepted a job from his father-in-law to work for Nintendo. Arakawa had gone to graduate school at MIT in America, and after meeting and marrying Hiroshi Yamauchi's daughter, Yoko Yamauchi, their family eventually moved to Canada to work in real estate. Yamauchi wanted to expand Nintendo, so he called upon Arakawa to set up an American branch. Arakawa was at first hesitant, both due to his own successful real estate venture and Yoko wanting distance from the Nintendo family business. However, in the end, he was convinced and his family moved to New York to found Nintendo of America, with Yoko becoming its very first employee. Arakawa went on to hire kids from arcades to work in a warehouse, who he'd often work alongside, and hired Al Stone and Ron Judy to become Nintendo of America's sales team. The contract was looked over by a lawyer, Howard Lincoln, and the newly formed team got to work, but to only minimal success. The game that was meant to turn around the company? An arcade game by the name of Radar Scope. Arakawa had tested it in sites around Seattle to positive results, so he decided to place an order for 3,000 units, which was just about all Nintendo of America could afford at the time. And the gamble failed. Despite the positive test results, by the time the 3,000 units were shipped, all interest in the game had been lost. Arakawa lowered the price, yet they were only able to sell 1,000 units, and Nintendo of America was flopping fast. Arakawa moved the headquarters from New York to Seattle in order to be closer to Japan and called his father-in-law for help. They needed something to replace Radar Scope and one of Nintendo's best designers to create something amazing that could save the American operation. But all of Yamauchi's top designers were too tied up, so he decided to give an apprentice a chance, Shigeru Miyamoto. Yamauchi pulled Miyamoto into his office and asked him to convert the Radar Scope flop into something new. Overseen by Gunpei Yokoi, Miyamoto decided that the popular shooting games of the day were unimaginative and wanted to create something different. Given free reign, with Yokoi making sure everything worked given the technical limitations of arcades, Miyamoto created Donkey Kong and his iconic hero Jumpman. Jumpman was designed based on the technical limitations of the era. He was given a large nose to give him personality, a hat because hair was difficult to properly animate, brightly visible overall so he could be seen on screen, and a mustache to help exaggerate the nose. Donkey Kong was shipped to the American team of Nintendo to the disbelief of the team. After turning on the game and first seeing it, Al Stone commented, "It's over," walking out thinking Nintendo of America was finished. Back in Japan, Yamauchi ignored the criticism, telling them it was a great game. In the midst of translating Donkey Kong, the owner of the warehouse they were working in interrupted them to yell at Arakawa for being late in paying their rent. His name was Mario Segali, and thus, Super Mario was born. Donkey Kong ended up selling over 60,000 units to the tune of over $100 million in sales. Howard Lincoln worked on more and more contracts for the company. Donkey Kong was licensed out to Coleco in 1981, who gained the rights to Donkey Kong for a video game system and their ColecoVision. Meanwhile, Atari gained the floppy disk computer game rights. It was sunshine and rainbows for Nintendo. That is, at least, until 1982, when MCA Universal notified Arakawa and Nintendo of America that Donkey Kong was infringing on their rights to King Kong, and Nintendo had 48 hours to turn over all profits from the game, as well as destroying all unsold games. A week later, Arakawa and Lincoln met with MCA Universal and then President Sid Sheinberg's attorney, who threatened to sue Nintendo unless they settled. Lincoln refused, telling them, "If you own King Kong, and it is infringed by Donkey Kong, then we'll settle. But I'm not going to buy the goddamn Brooklyn Bridge. First, you'll have to prove to me that you own King Kong." This infuriated Sheinberg's attorneys and roused suspicion in Lincoln. He requested the chain of title from Universal, which would prove their ownership, however, was never sent it, rousing more suspicion. A month later, Arakawa and Lincoln flew back to Universal and met with Sheinberg himself in Universal's executive dining room. Sheinberg announced how pleased he was Nintendo would settle when Lincoln dropped the bomb. "We have done a lot of research on this thing, looked at it from the top to bottom, and we feel that there is no infringement. We have no intention of settling." Infuriated, Sheinberg demanded to know what was going on, to which Lincoln responded, "I wanted to tell you we weren't going to settle, and I wanted to do it by looking you right in the eyes. That, Mr. Sheinberg, is what I'm doing." Arakawa and Lincoln were kicked out of the conference, and Sheinberg immediately sued Nintendo for copyright infringement. Nintendo met with an attorney, John Kirby, who would represent them as the defense. As Kirby and Lincoln worked together on the case, Arakawa asked Lincoln if he would leave his law firm and work exclusively for Nintendo. Lincoln agreed, becoming Nintendo of America's vice president. Finally, the court date came. After reviewing the materials, the judge came to a decision. Not only did Donkey Kong not infringe on the rights of King Kong, as it was completely different from the movie, but it turned out Universal didn't even own the rights to King Kong. In fact, MCA Universal themselves had previously been in their own lawsuit about King Kong, one in which they themselves proved King Kong was in the public domain. Nintendo was awarded $1.8 million in damages, Howard Lincoln had become the vice president of Nintendo of America, and John Kirby himself received a little recognition. Nintendo gifted him a $30,000 sailboat named Donkey Kong, and according to Shigeru Miyamoto, the character from the titular Kirby games was named after him. Meanwhile, in R&D 1, Gunpei Yokoi would come up with the Game & Watch in 1980, a major hit bringing in millions for the company. In 1982, in working on a port for Donkey Kong for the Game & Watch, Yokoi devised the D-pad, which was so popular, Nintendo ended up patenting it. With the success of the Color Game TV6 and 15, as well as Game & Watch, Yamauchi wanted to compete in the big leagues. He tasked Uemura with creating a console that could not just compete with the Atari 2600 in television and more, but be so far advanced that other companies couldn't copy their specs for at least a year. Uemura toiled away to the sound of 18-hour days, working with Nintendo's arcade engineers in order to determine what was most important to include in a game machine. While 16-bit processors were available, they were far too expensive for a consumer market, so he settled on an 8-bit processor. He and his team then worked day and night with engineers and programmers, modifying circuitry in order to create something truly special. Meanwhile, Yamauchi was busy negotiating the price of chips from semiconductor companies, trying to get the cheapest prices and quickest results. He was shot down by almost every company until he struck a deal with Ricoh by guaranteeing a 3 million chip order within 2 years. People thought he was insane, as leading game console manufacturers in Japan were only selling 20 to 30,000 units of their consoles. However, in order to get his deal, he stuck to his guns. They decided to leave out all peripherals, such as a keyboard, in order to save on costs. However, Yamauchi had the team include a connector that could lead to expansions on their new system. Yamauchi himself made the final decisions for how the system would look and feel, deciding on a more simplistic controller as opposed to the more elaborate ones which had been trending. They decided to use the D-pad from the Game & Watch titles instead of the standard joystick of the time, and 2 main buttons. Clean and simple. And with that, in 1983, Nintendo's first full-fledged video game system was released to Japan, the Nintendo Famicom. Thanks in part to excessive advertising, the Famicom was an immediate success in Japan, selling 500,000 units. However, it was too early to celebrate. More and more Famicoms were freezing up, and Nintendo engineers found the problem. One of the circuits would get locked up, and the circuitry on the chip of potentially every Famicom would need to be replaced. Despite the heavy cost, Yamauchi took a gamble wanting to earn consumers' trust and decided to not just replace broken Famicoms, but recall every single one of them. This cost the company millions of dollars, but in the end paid off. Over 1 million Famicoms sold, and every home that had one wanted more games. The Famicom was so successful, its competitors ended up leaving the market, and suddenly, Nintendo had propelled itself to becoming one of the biggest names in video games. At least in Japan, that is. America, however, would be a whole other story. Game & Watch had sold poorly in America, no thanks to a failed commercial campaign, and was dissolved. Yamauchi decided it was time to bring the Famicom to America, and due to their previous negotiation over the rights to Donkey Kong, he decided to contact Ray Kassar of Atari to see if Atari would like to purchase the worldwide rights to Nintendo. Nintendo had no foothold in distribution outside of Japan, and felt having the known entity of Atari as the distributor, for a nominal fee of course, was the best set of action. After heavy negotiations between Atari and Nintendo, with Yamauchi doing his absolute best to intimidate Atari into signing an agreement that strongly favored Nintendo, an agreement was reached in May 1983. The papers would be signed in the following month at the Summer Consumer Electronics Show in Chicago. CES came, only for both Nintendo and Atari to discover Coleco showing off their new Atom computer system playing Donkey Kong. While Coleco did own the video game console rights to Donkey Kong, Atari had the exclusive computer floppy disk rights to the game and were furious, threatening to cancel the deal to purchase the worldwide rights to the Famicom. Nintendo in turn called an emergency meeting with Coleco, where Yamauchi slammed them for what they had done. Coleco, claiming their Atom was a computer with a video game system inside, had unintentionally screwed Nintendo. While the debacle was worked out, by July 1983, Ray Kassar was fired from Atari, and the contract never signed. Later that year, Nintendo learned from a former Atari attorney that Atari never intended to buy the Famicom, but were negotiating purely to hold Nintendo from cutting another deal and to try and learn about the hardware. The Atari deal was dead. Still, Yamauchi wanted to bring the Famicom to America, but a lot had happened, namely the infamous gaming crash of 1983. Between Atari 2600's overabundance of poor games and the release of the dismal Pac-Man adaptation, as well as E.T., sales had gone to an all-time low. So much so, distributors were refusing to even carry video game consoles in their stores or attempt to sell them in any fashion. Arakawa felt there had to be a way to get stores to carry the Famicom. He decided not to market it as a toy, both due to the unadvantageous distribution standards of selling a toy, and to separate Nintendo from other video game consoles. Peripherals for the American Famicom, such as a keyboard and zapper light gun, were designed by NCL, and the system would be called the Advanced Video System, or AVS for short. In order to avoid horrible counterfeit and third-party games flooding the market for the AVS, as had happened to the Atari 2600, which in turn crashed the market, NCL created a security chip for the AVS where only Nintendo cartridges would have the key that would allow the AVS to play the game. Don James and Howard Phillips of Nintendo played hundreds of Japanese Famicom games to help Arakawa determine the 40 best which would be translated to English. Finally, the AVS was ready, and in January 1985, James, Phillips, Howard Lincoln, and Arakawa unveiled the system at CES January 1985, and no one would buy it. Those who stopped by thought kids would hate the keyboard, disliked most of the other peripherals, and were still terrified just to purchase anything after Atari 2600 has sunk so bad. With these perceptions in hand, Arakawa decided to scrap the learning elements on the AVS and focus on fun. Gunpei Yokoi's R&D team developed the ROB, or Robotic Operating Buddy, in order to help sell the system. Instead of loading cartridges from the top, the AVS would load cartridges from the side and was then made to be much simpler. This new version was dubbed the Nintendo Entertainment System by Arakawa, or the NES. And at CES June 1985, the NES was revealed to the world to still not great results. The reaction was better as buyers liked ROB, but they still didn't want to actually order any. Arakawa decided to create a focus group of kids to showcase how great the system was, and in observing them from behind a one-way mirror, overheard the standard comment of, "This is shit." Arakawa was ready to give up, but Yamauchi refused, telling Arakawa, "Try to sell the system in one American city. Then, if it fails, it fails." Arakawa was given a budget of $50 million, and the city was chosen, New York City. Sam Borofsky Associated Limited of New York was appointed to be the system's sales representatives. Initially, the NES was set to retail for $170. However, Sam Borofsky pointed out the Commodore 64 computer was retailing for $150 due to low sales, and the NES would have to compete with that. The price point was dropped to $140. In summer 1985, Arakawa rented a warehouse in Hackensack, New Jersey, and both Nintendo of America and Japan employees were flown in. Howard Lincoln and Arakawa made calls with retailers, while Ron Judy worked on advertising campaigns and promotion. They went to shopping malls to set up demonstrations of their systems, and paid athletes to do the demonstrations in order to get mall managers to agree to it. The full team went in person to push the console, visiting toy stores, electronic retailers, and department stores. They pushed for various chains to carry the system, mostly meeting with criticism. Finally, Arakawa came to a decision. Nintendo would make carrying the NES completely risk-free. They offered to stock stores and set up displays for free, and after 90 days, stores would only need to pay Nintendo for what they had sold and could return the rest. You see, typically, stores take the risk by ordering a certain amount of product and paying wholesale for it, regardless of how well their purchases sell. So, Nintendo's risk-free proposition finally got store owners to bite. The NES launched in October, with Rob becoming the focus of Nintendo's ads. Working 18-hour days, 7 days a week, for 3 months, Nintendo employees worked day and night setting up displays, making constant sales calls, and standing next to sports stars as they tried to pitch the NES to passerbys. Anything to get customers to at least try playing the NES. Even so, they were still met with opposition. A manager would be convinced to carry the NES, only to have a vice president shoot it down. One mall refused to let Nintendo turn on any of the video games, believing them to attract the wrong sort of crowd, and it only wanted to use them to get a famous athlete in the mall. Reporters acknowledged the NES was superior to the Atari 2600, with better graphics and games, but still felt consumers wouldn't care. In advertising, because of the stigma around Atari, use of the word video game was forbidden, and Nintendo's only to be known as an entertainment system. Likewise, their games weren't cartridges, but game packs. Anything to set them as far apart from Atari 2600 as possible. They came up with the catchphrase,
"Now you are playing with power."
Finally, by Christmas 1985, they were able to convince between 500 to 600 stores in New York City to carry the NES. The NES wasn't an immediate success, but did well. It had sold half of the 100,000 units that had been shipped from Japan, and stores were finally opening up to carrying the system. From New York, they moved on to LA in February, then Chicago, San Francisco, and Texas, before finally going national. Most assumed it was a temporary anomaly, but the NES kept on selling. Nintendo brought on Peter Main, the head of marketing in America. Main brought a hot tip to industry analysts, presenting them with Nintendo's Japanese success, no debt, and a lock on 90% of the Japanese gaming industry. Suddenly, major chains started to believe Nintendo was the next big thing and actually buying the NES. Arakawa and team had done it. The NES was finally selling. And there was more good news on the way. The return of King Kong's carpenter-turned-plumber Mario. Along with Takashi Tezuka, Shigeru Miyamoto created Super Mario Bros. The game took its running and jumping mechanics from Donkey Kong Jr. and initially included the ability for Mario to attack by kicking and using a rifle or a beam gun. Miyamoto specifically wanted to focus on the jumping mechanic of the game and take it to the next level, feeling he had conceptualized the idea of jumping as a game mechanic with Donkey Kong. This ended up taking the center stage of the game. Finally, most games at the time had a black background to make them easier for players to see what was going on. Miyamoto had felt like the time had come when people were tiring of that, and he thought it might be a good idea to have a primary color background that varies. So they utilized the technical capabilities of the Famicom to the full, and decided to make Super Mario Bros. Based on the concept of having a large character that would negotiate land, sea, and air. Early in development, Koji Kondo was brought in to score the game, creating its iconic scores, saying, "The Super Mario Bros. Music was inspired by the game controls, and its purpose to heighten the feeling of how the game controls." By the end of 1985, the game was so successful, Nintendo decided to bundle it with the Famicom to help console sales as a whole, and near the end of 1986, they brought the game to America doing the same tactic to wild success. 1986 also marked the year Nintendo released the Famicom Disk System in Japan. Priced at over $100, Nintendo promised to release bigger and better games as the discs had a larger memory capacity than cartridges. Typical of Nintendo at the time, their terms were stringent, and they wanted half ownership of all games made for the disk drive. Licensees hated it, both because of this and because they had to determine if they should make a game for the disk drive, Famicom, or both. Advancements in semiconductor and cartridge technology were made, and by 1990, Nintendo had backed away from supporting the disk system. In order to avoid the pitfalls the Atari 2600 had gone through, and, well, to earn more money, Nintendo set up a licensing program which would earn something Ron Judy devised, the Nintendo Seal of Quality. Using the NES's new lockout chip, Nintendo was able to effectively put a stranglehold on what games were created for the NES. Without becoming a licensee and earning a seal of quality, companies couldn't create games on the NES. This would allow Nintendo both to prevent a massive influx of horrible games from flooding the market, which had been one of the factors that had ruined Atari, as well as make a profit from every NES game, regardless of who made it. Nintendo would also manufacture the cartridges themselves, charging $9 to $14 per cartridge, which covered both royalties and manufacturing charges, and completely controlled how many cartridges each company was allotted. Nintendo's terms for becoming a licensee were strict. Nintendo had to approve the game, packaging, artwork, and commercials. They enforced a 2-year exclusivity clause where every game created for the NES had to be exclusive to the system for 2 years. Nintendo was also allowed to censor as they saw fit, meaning they could prevent games like Custer's Revenge coming out for the NES. At Nintendo of America headquarters, Don James, Howard Phillips, and Shigeru Oda formed the Big Three. They would evaluate all games on a 40-point scale to determine if they were good enough for the Nintendo seal of quality. If there were any questions, the GC6, or 6-game counselors, would evaluate the game. From there, if Arakawa still wanted more feedback, they would test the game in front of kids to see how they reacted. To even further ensure the quality of the games, Nintendo only allowed licensees to create 5 games a year, and that was it. This was to push developers to focus on making 5 great games instead of pushing out garbage. And while it actually may have been an incredibly smart move at the time, especially after the Atari 2600, third-party developers were not impressed. Hardly anyone bit, especially American companies. Games were selling well enough on PC, and they still weren't prepared to give Nintendo a shot, especially with these terms. The first companies to comply to Nintendo's terms were companies who had already been doing business with Nintendo in Japan. Companies such as Capcom, Konami, Bandai, Namco, and Taito, who would all become major players in the console market. Capcom and Konami were especially successful. Konami hit hard with Castlevania in 1986, the game spawning over 20 sequels and various remakes. Konami also created hits like Contra and Gradius. In 1987, Konami became the first company Nintendo allowed to have a workaround to their 5-game rule. They were allowed to create a second company, Ultra, to gain another 5 games. Ultra became extremely successful, with its first release being Hideo Kojima's Metal Gear, and more importantly for the time, Ultra received a license to make Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle games, which sold through the roof. Meanwhile, Capcom began with arcade ports until finally birthing Mega Man in 1987. Mega Man only received mild success. However, its sequel was so well regarded, it blew Mega Man up into one of the most recognized video game franchises still to this day. They also received a license to make Disney games, creating the popular DuckTales title. They also created Yo-Noid, based off the Domino's mascot. That was a good one too. Notably, the JRPG genre began during the NES era with the title Dragon Quest, renamed Dragon Warrior for the NES, which would become one of the Famicom's most popular franchises in Japan. While most elements in the game had been done before on the PC, the game's success made it the template for future JRPGs. Iterating on Dragon Quest's formula, Squaresoft's Final Fantasy also got its start on the NES. Final Fantasy became a huge hit for Squaresoft and one of the most iconic game franchises. Back at Nintendo, Shigeru Miyamoto was busy creating his next masterpiece, The Legend of Zelda in 1986, released to the States on the NES in 1987. Inspired by his youthful explorations in Kyoto, as well as getting lost amidst all of the sliding doors in his family's home in Sonobe, Japan, The Legend of Zelda was meant to recreate these feelings of exploration and mystery. The Legend of Zelda, which was directed and designed by both Shigeru Miyamoto and Takashi Tezuka, was such a big adventure that it became the first game to include an internal battery and allow players to actually save their progress as opposed to just using passwords, as was the standard at the time. Koji Kondo, composer of the music to Super Mario Bros., was tasked with creating music for Zelda as well, and managed to create yet more of gaming's most memorable music. The Legend of Zelda was a smash hit, becoming the first non-bundled NES title to sell over 1 million units. The very same year, Gunpei Yokoi's R&D 1 at Nintendo headquarters developed Metroid. Directed by Satoru Okada, Metroid focused on non-linear exploration, with emphasis on finding parts which would upgrade its protagonist, Samus Aran. The title's gameplay was so popular, games still borrow heavily from its overall design. Beyond The Legend of Zelda and Metroid, Nintendo had decided to port their arcade game, Punch-Out!, into a Famicom title. Minoru Arakawa had attended a Mike Tyson boxing match and was so impressed by his skill, he wanted to license the boxer for the game. He agreed to this, to their great fortune. Later that year, Mike Tyson won his first WBC title from Trevor Berbick, rising him to stardom and only better helping sell the game, and especially helping sell the NES to an American audience.
You've gotta beat Mike Tyson.
And, in part thanks to Nintendo's R&D 3, the games were only getting bigger and better. Genyo Takeda's R&D 3 team focused on creating better iterations of Nintendo's cartridges, allowing for technical achievements the Famicom and NES could never have reached on their own. The cartridges could take on processes typically dedicated to the main console, freeing up space, increasing speed, increasing game size, and allowing more unique tile patterns. Mega Man 1, released in 1987 as an example, was meant to have 8 bosses in their game. Due to limitations, it had to drop the number down to 6. Mega Man 2, released in 1988, not only looked better, but was also able to finally fit 8 bosses into the game. R&D3 also developed the battery system that was implemented into Zelda, allowing players to save their games. It was in 1987 that American developers finally started to bite. Seeing the massive success Nintendo had been gaining, Acclaim, a company developed by former Activision employees, was the first to sign on. And from there, it was only a matter of time before other companies realized just how much money they could be making and also signed on. By 1991, there were over 100 licensees. In the 1986 fiscal year, Nintendo sold 1.8 million game consoles, 5.4 million in 1987 and 9.3 million in 1988, with 7 million being the NES. By 1989, 1 in every 4 American homes owned an NES. By the end of the NES's lifetime, it sold over 60 million units. With the newfound popularity of Nintendo, in 1986, Nintendo set up phone lines to service customer service. By the end of 1987, they had 550 people hired, answering over 150,000 calls a week. By 1990, they were being bombarded by so many calls they had to cancel the free 800 line as it had grown so expensive. Nintendo continued to bombard the Americas with the major marketing push, setting up World of Nintendo displays in stores, which won awards from the Point of Purchase Advertising Institute. They then set up a Nintendo Fun Club for consumers who sent in warranty cards, where they would be sent a Nintendo newsletter. This was so successful that by 1988 there were over 1 million members. Thanks to this success, Arakawa decided to create Nintendo Power, which would be a Nintendo-dedicated gaming magazine with no outside advertisements, so Nintendo could choose to only promote what they deemed to be good games. Gail Tilden, who had recently left the company because she'd had a baby, was called back in to work on the magazine, and the first edition was sent to 5 million people for free in January 1989. 1.5 million of those people subscribed for $15 a month, and suddenly, Nintendo had an easy tool to market any game they wanted. Nintendo had become a triumphant hit. Nintendo was selling toys and cereal of their popular franchises. TV shows such as the Super Mario Bros. Super Show, Captain N the Game Master, and Mega Man spawned from the popular Nintendo franchises. Meanwhile, movies based on Super Mario Bros. And Double Dragon were also created, both to dismal reviews. Nintendo even managed to market their Power Glove peripheral and Super Mario Bros. 3 through 1989's The Wizard.
I love the Power Glove. It's so bad.
In 1988, Yamauchi attempted to make Nintendo a communications company with the Family Computer Communications Network system. This was a very primitive version of the internet, which hooked the Famicom up to telephone lines and allowed players to play with each other. So, yes, players could actually play with one another using a system akin to the internet as early as with the Famicom. They attempted to target not just kids, but adults as well, by allowing adults to do tasks such as banking, betting on horse races, and buying postal stamps. The service, however, was a failure in Japan, as adults still viewed the Famicom as a toy for children. On the American front, a cartridge was developed for the NES which would bring users to a menu of network choices. This was meant to include a chat line for kids, the ability to have your own user handle, and a way to get online tips. They also wanted to develop an NES disk drive so kids could download games onto it. Arakawa never put his full-fledged support into it, and by 1992, the American version was never realized. While Nintendo was finally starting to see incredible success, they started to face backlash from their licensees. In 1988, there was allegedly a worldwide microchip shortage, which prevented Nintendo from creating as many cartridges as licensees wanted. While this was likely true, Nintendo was put on blast for either fabricating the story to keep supply low and demand high, or not buying more expensive chips to keep up with demand. Licensees were also pissed at Nintendo's ranking system, as Nintendo chose how many cartridges each company would get for their games, and were accused of favoritism. While their games were indeed selling out, company presidents would order 1 million cartridges to only get 200,000 and beg for more only to be shot down. Licensees were also pissed at Nintendo Power, accusing Nintendo of favoritism, especially of their own games, as the magazine had so much marketing sway. Nintendo had become so successful that they essentially had a monopoly over the video game industry, and companies were not pleased, especially one in particular, Atari. As a result of the fallout from the video game crash, Atari was split into two parts: Atari Games, which consisted of its arcade business, and Atari Corporation, which consisted of its game console business. Atari Games had been sold to Namco, and Atari Corporation to Jack Tramiel. Thanks to the split, Atari Games was locked out of creating console games, and due to disagreements between the Japanese and American heads of Namco, Atari Games was subsequently sold again to the head of Namco America, Hide Nakajima. Nakajima resigned from his presidency of Namco to run Atari Games and created a new company, Tengen, in order to create NES games. Nakajima had Tengen become a Nintendo licensee, and Nintendo were excited to do so. Having Atari, the former giant, as their licensee would only prove their dominance. However, Nakajima wanted exceptions from Nintendo's 5-game rule, and Arakawa refused. Already annoyed, Tengen signed on with Nintendo anyways, bringing with it conversions of arcade hits like Pac-Man and Gauntlet. But just as they were poised to do so, Nintendo was hit by the worldwide microchip shortage, and Tengen's cartridge orders were sliced into a quarter of what they had requested, infuriating them. While all this was going on, Atari Games had been secretly two-facing Nintendo and working on a workaround to Nintendo's security chip. Just 10 days after Tengen signed on as a Nintendo licensee, Atari Games falsely claimed they were being sued by Nintendo in order to file an affidavit, oddly the only way to obtain Nintendo's copyrighted materials, which just so happened to include the 10 NES copyright, which was the code for Nintendo's security chip. Tengen successfully copied the code and called their chip the Rabbit. Then, in December 1988, Atari Games filed a lawsuit against Nintendo for monopolistic and exclusionary business practices for a sum of $100 million. They charged that the sole purpose of the lockout system was to lock out competition. Nakajima met with Arakawa, proposing Atari Games would withdraw their lawsuit if Nintendo would let them manufacture their own cartridges, and was more lenient with them as a licensee. Arakawa refused, Atari Games started producing their own cartridges, and Nintendo fought back. Nintendo immediately filed a countersuit against Atari, claiming they violated the Racketeer Influence and Corrupt Organization Act by using Tengen as a front to defraud them. Nintendo locked them out of their January 1989 CES booth and then approached retailers. They threatened retailers small and large that if they carried Tengen's cartridges, it was a violation of their IP and they would take legal action. Not wanting to fight with the giant, now making them massive amounts of money, retailers complied. As one software firm put it bluntly for the magazine The American Lawyer, "You don't fuck with the 900-pound gorilla." Ironically, in 1989, Sam and Jack Tramiel of Atari Corporation also ended up suing Nintendo over antitrust laws, this time for their 2-year exclusivity clause and to the tune of $160 million. Finally, in 1991, the court came to a decision. Atari lied to the Copyright Office in order to obtain the copyrighted 10 NES program. The court disapproves of Atari's argument that Nintendo's subsequent claims of infringement retroactively justify dishonesty. Judge Fern Smith then concluded Nintendo had the right to exclude others and reserve to itself if it chooses, there and then allowing Nintendo to lock out competitors. Atari Games had completely screwed themselves by stealing Nintendo's code. In 1992, a jury found Nintendo innocent of Atari Corporation's charge as they found Atari Corporation had not been damaged by Nintendo's business practices. By 1990, Nintendo's annual legal bills were $20 million. Atari Games continued to fling lawsuits at Nintendo, claiming patent infringement. MAGNAVOX and an inventor also sued over patents, and Nintendo settled with both. Alpex Games sued Nintendo for patent infringement and won, being awarded $252 million, although the decision was later reversed in 1996. Not only were other companies on Nintendo, but so was the US government. Encouraged on by Atari Games, in 1989, the US launched an investigation of Nintendo for antitrust issues. Representative Dennis Eckert held a press conference on Pearl Harbor Day 1989 with a report sent to the Justice Department's antitrust chief, writing, Nintendo had stifled competition by blocking competitors' software cartridges from working and enforcing restrictive licensing agreements. He pointed out that IBM and Apple computers were open source, allowing any company to create software onto their hardware, and video games should be as well. By 1990, the case was pushed from the Justice Department onto the FTC to handle. All the pressure from the US helped prompt Nintendo to further their reach into Europe. Mattel had been signed on to distribute the NES in Australia, New Zealand, Germany, and the UK. They were successful in New Zealand and Australia, however, failed to do a good job in Europe, with computers in the Sega Master System vastly outperforming the NES. Ron Judy, formerly of Nintendo of America, had formed Nintendo International in Paris and sold the system to France and Scandinavia to better results. Finally, in the early 1990s, Nintendo had Shigeru Ota open the Nintendo of Europe offices, who would work with Ron Judy. The FTC investigation also prompted Nintendo to ease up on their licensing restrictions, allowing some to manufacture their own games. Nintendo also eased up on their exclusivity clause, allowing companies to publish their games for other systems. In 1991, Nintendo was finally slapped by the FTC for price fixing. They've been charged for pressuring retailers to keep prices of games and systems at the same cost and not allowing them to drop the price. And their giant penalty for doing so? A settlement resulting in offering consumers who purchased an NES between 1988 and 1990 a $5 off coupon on Nintendo merchandise. That was it. Nintendo itself went on the offensive against Blockbuster and video game rental stores in 1989, proposing the rental industry was hurting their business. They tried multiple bills to either prevent rental companies from having their games, or at least lock them out of renting games for the first year after its release. All of these bills failed to even make it to court. In 1990, Nintendo sued Louis Galoob over his invention, the Game Genie. The Game Genie allowed players to enter in cheats that hadn't existed in the game. And in 1991, the very same judge presiding over the Atari case, Judge Fern Smith, ruled in favor of Galoob, stating the Game Genie to be fair use. Nintendo also went after counterfeiters, managing to find a large Taiwanese counterfeit ring. Executives from a giant multi-million-dollar Taiwanese company, United Microelectronics, were creating counterfeits, and Nintendo tied the counterfeiters to the Taiwanese government, who had a 30% interest in United Microelectronics. Nintendo also had to fight off against companies who would attempt to zap the NES security chip, effectively disabling it. They did so by releasing new iterations of the NES, each of which did a better job withstanding this. One company Nintendo didn't pursue was Wisdom Tree, creator of the infamous Bible and Christian-themed games such as Bible Adventures. Oddly, the company was an offshoot of Color Dreams, which also published notoriously bad games, just with decidedly less Christian themes. Nintendo likely didn't pursue Wisdom Tree in order to avoid potential bad PR. All the lawsuits and counterfeiters spoke to one thing in particular: Nintendo's extreme success with the Famicom and NES. Nintendo had managed to completely revitalize an industry that everyone in America had written off as dead. In 1988 alone, they saw $2.3 billion in sales. In 1990, Nintendo released Super Mario Bros. 3, which alone sold 17 million copies. However, Nintendo wasn't done yet. Gunpei Yokoi and R&D 1 were hard at work on a handheld console, and Masayuki Uemura's R&D 2 team was busy working on a more powerful console to follow up the Famicom. While Nintendo was busy basking in their success, a competitor was rising, one who would take Nintendo to task and humble the now mammoth company. If you enjoyed this video, I highly recommend picking up the book Game Over by David Sheff, as it goes into even more detail about a lot of the topics I covered. Additionally, many of the early Nintendo images were from beforemario.com, which I recommend checking out. All sources for the information in this video can be found in the description below. And if you enjoyed, make sure to check out more from my Chronicles of Gaming series, or my comedic retrospective series, The Super Shows. And I'll see you next time. Peace.